She was shaking so hard her teeth chattered, not from the Georgia cold, but from the 3 men following her for 6 blocks. One last streetlight, then darkness. She stopped in front of a man who looked like every nightmare she'd ever had. Leather vest, iron jaw, arms wrapped in ink that told stories she didn't want to know. She looked up at him and said the only thing she could think of. "Please, walk me home." He didn't answer right away. He just turned, and she heard the sound, 50 engines rumbling to life all at once, filling the night like thunder with nowhere to go. What happened next, nobody in Savannah saw coming. Savannah Cross had a rule she'd built over years of hard lessons: never walk home after 9. It wasn't written anywhere. Nobody had handed it to her on a card or whispered it as advice. It had come the way all the real rules of her life had come. Through the body, through fear that settled into muscle memory until caution became instinct. She knew the blocks between the diner where she worked and her apartment on Drayton Street, the way a soldier knows a minefield, by what to avoid, not what to cross. But on a Thursday night in late October, the night bus didn't come. Her phone battery had hit 0 somewhere between the dessert rush and closing time, and the diner's back door had been double-locked by Marcus from the kitchen before she'd had a chance to ask anyone for a ride. And so Savannah found herself on the corner of Broughton and Jefferson at 9:40 in the evening, with nothing but a canvas tote bag, $22 in tip money, and the particular kind of loneliness that doesn't announce itself but sits in the chest like a stone. Savannah, Georgia, in October, wore its beauty like a faded photograph. The Spanish moss hanging from the live oaks, silvery and still in the windless night, the gas lamps along the squares throwing amber pools onto the cobblestones, the old antebellum facades staring back at passing strangers with the indifference of things that have seen too much. It was a city of contradictions, magnificent and closed, historic and stuck, gracious on its surface and ruthless underneath for anyone who didn't fit its idea of what a person should be. Savannah Cross didn't fit. She was 28 years old, 5'9", with long chestnut hair she'd grown carefully over 6 years and green eyes that she'd inherited from a mother she no longer spoke to. She'd been in Savannah for 3 years, had worked at the same diner for 2 of them, and had built a life that was small but hers. The studio apartment with the leaking faucet and the spider plant on the windowsill, the 2 regulars at work who knew her name and used it right, the Friday night phone calls with her friend Dana in Atlanta, who always made her laugh even when nothing felt funny. She started walking. The first block was fine. The gas lamps were working, and there was a couple walking a golden retriever on the opposite side of the street, the dog pulling toward every shadow with delighted obliviousness. Savannah felt her shoulders drop a little. Her shoes, ballet flats that were wrong for this weather, wrong for any serious walking, clicked lightly on the uneven sidewalk. She passed the 2nd block. Halfway through the 3rd, she heard them. Not loud. That was the thing about this kind of threat. It didn't announce itself with shouting or running. It came quietly, in the particular cadence of footsteps that are keeping pace. 3 sets of them, unhurried, deliberate. She felt it before she could confirm it. The bristling at the base of the neck, the narrowing of peripheral vision, the instinct that says something is wrong before the brain has caught up. She turned slightly, not enough to acknowledge them, just enough to see. 3 men, mid-20s to early 30s, baseball caps and dark jackets, close enough that she could hear their voices, but not their words. They were looking at her, not past her, at her. She knew that look. She'd been on the receiving end of it enough times to recognize it the way a person recognizes a weather pattern, the kind that means batten down. She picked up her pace. They picked up theirs. She crossed to the other side of Abercorn Street, moving past a darkened boutique and a bar whose noise spilled into the street. The bar's customers were inside. The sidewalk was hers alone. She thought briefly about stepping into the bar, but she'd tried that once before, 2 years ago in a different city, and what she'd walked into had been almost worse than what she'd walked away from. She kept moving. By the fourth block, one of the men had said something. The words unclear, but the tone unmistakable, low and taunting, directed at her back. Her jaw tightened. She shifted her bag to her shoulder and scanned ahead. Still 4 blocks to Drayton Street. 4 blocks felt like 40. It was at the corner of Harris Street that she saw the motorcycles. There were so many of them that for a moment her brain couldn't count. A long column of bikes parked along the street outside a place called the Iron Rail, a bar she'd walked past before but never gone near, the kind of establishment that told you everything you needed to know about its clientele by the sign above the door and the machines outside it. Harleys, mostly, heavy and chrome-bright under the street lamp, and among them a group of men in leather vests bearing a patch she recognized without wanting to. The death's head insignia of a chapter she'd seen in the news enough times to understand what it meant. She stopped walking. Behind her, the 3 men slowed. They were half a block back, close enough that retreat in their direction was no longer an option. Ahead of her, a bar full of bikers whose reputation was built on everything she'd been told to fear. To her left, a locked gate leading to a private courtyard. To her right, a dark alley that went nowhere good. Savannah Cross stood at the intersection of everything she'd been warned about her entire life, and understood, with terrible clarity, that she had to choose. She chose forward. The man standing nearest to the door was large, not in the exaggerated way of someone who spent their life performing size, but in the way of someone who had simply always occupied space and stopped apologizing for it. He was leaning against the wall beside the entrance, a beer in one hand, talking to nobody. He wore a leather vest over a flannel shirt, and his arms, crossed loosely over his chest, were covered in ink. His beard was going grey. His eyes, when they found her, were dark and calm and completely unreadable. She stopped in front of him. Her hands were shaking. She felt it, the fine tremor in her fingers, the way her breath was coming a little too fast. Behind her, she could hear the footsteps of the 3 men slowing again, uncertain now, recalibrating. She looked up at the man in front of her. She said the only thing she could think of, "Please, walk me home." His name was Reed Calloway, though Savannah didn't know that yet. She knew only what she could see, a man who looked like every warning she'd ever received made flesh, standing between her and the open air of Harris Street, looking down at her with an expression she couldn't read. He was perhaps 44, with the particular stillness of someone who had spent a great many years not reacting to things until he'd decided whether they were worth reacting to. Reed Calloway looked at the woman in front of him. He looked past her, down the street, and saw the 3 men who had stopped about 30 feet back. They were standing in a loose cluster, hands in their pockets, the body language of people pretending they weren't waiting for something. He looked back at her. Her hands were shaking. Her jaw was set in a way that told him she was working hard not to show how afraid she was. She was looking up at him with green eyes that held something he recognized, not the thing people expected him to recognize, not weakness, but the specific resolve of someone who has run out of every other option and has made the decision to try the thing that scares them most. He'd seen that look before. He'd worn it himself a long time ago. He said nothing for a beat. Then he turned his head toward the open door behind him and said, without raising his voice, "Troy." A man appeared in the doorway, 51 years old, barrel-chested, with a grey ponytail and a face that had logged a few too many miles. Troy Haynes looked at Reed, looked at Savannah, looked past Savannah at the 3 men on the street, and then looked back at Reed with the particular understanding of 2 people who have spent decades in each other's company. "Yeah," Troy said. It wasn't a question. Reed set his beer down on the windowsill beside the door. He turned back to Savannah. "Where do you live?" She blinked. She hadn't expected that. She didn't know what she'd expected. Laughter, maybe. Dismissal. She'd expected to feel, in the new way she often felt when she'd miscalculated the world, that she'd made a terrible mistake. "Drayton Street," she said. "4 blocks." He nodded. "We'll walk you." The "we" was the thing she didn't understand at first. She understood it about 45 seconds later, when Troy Haynes stepped out of the bar and held the door open. And then, one after another, in 2s and 3s, men in leather vests began to file out onto the sidewalk. Not rushing, not making a show of it, just stepping out into the October night with the unhurried ease of people who have nothing to prove and know it. By the time the last of them had stepped outside, Savannah had stopped counting at 47. She stood on the sidewalk surrounded by more than 50 members of a motorcycle club whose reputation she had absorbed since childhood as shorthand for danger, and not one of them was looking at her with anything other than the casual indifference of people fulfilling a task. A few were finishing their beers. One man, younger than the rest, with freckles and a Red Sox cap that seemed entirely at odds with the rest of him, nodded at her with what she could only interpret as simple courtesy. She looked back down Harris Street. The 3 men were gone. Reed Calloway stepped up beside her, not too close, she noticed, not crowding her space, and gestured toward Drayton Street. "Lead the way," he said. She led the way. The procession moved through the Savannah night, like something out of a dream that hadn't decided yet whether it was good or bad. 50-some men in leather, boots on cobblestone, the sound of their passage filling the quiet streets with the particular weight of numbers. No one spoke loudly. A few conversations drifted at the back of the group. Ahead, the gas lamps of the old squares cast their amber light, and the Spanish moss moved almost imperceptibly in the October breeze. And Savannah Cross walked at the front of it all with her canvas tote bag and her $22 in tips and something in her chest she couldn't quite name yet. They were almost at Barnard Street when Troy Haynes fell into step on her other side, leaving a respectful gap between them, she noticed, and said conversationally, "You from Savannah?" 3 years, she said. "Good city," he said. "Gets under your skin." She glanced at him sideways. He was staring ahead with the relaxed expression of someone making small talk at a bus stop. "Yeah," she said after a moment. "It does." She noticed as they turned onto Drayton Street that a light was on in the front window of the apartment building she lived in. 2nd floor, 3rd window from the left. Darlene Pfeiffer's window. Her neighbor, 62, who grew African violets on her sill and watched the street the way people of her generation watch streets, not nosily but attentively, out of the long habit of paying attention to the world. Savannah saw the curtain move. She was going to have some explaining to do in the morning. They reached the front steps of her building. Savannah stopped and turned to face the group, which had stopped half a block back, she realized, without her noticing, giving her space. Reed Calloway stood a few feet from her, his hands in his jacket pockets, the expression on his face the same unreadable calm it had been since the first moment she'd spoken to him. She didn't know what to say. Nothing in her life had prepared her with the right words for this moment. "Thank you," she said. It came out a little unsteady. He nodded. She looked at the group, all those men, standing in her street, backlit by gas lamps, watching her with no particular expression at all. "All of you," she said louder. "Thank you." Someone at the back said, "Have a good night, ma'am." A few others echoed it, casual and earnest at once. She turned and went up the steps. She didn't look back. But she heard them, the slow movement of boots on pavement, the sound of the group beginning to walk back the way they'd come, unhurried as ever, already moving on to whatever the rest of the night held for them. She opened her door, stepped inside, pressed her back against the closed door in the dark hallway, and stood very still for a long moment. The canvas bag at her feet, the silence of the building around her, the spider plant on the windowsill catching the glow from outside. She realized her hands had stopped shaking. By 7 the next morning, Darlene Pfeiffer was at Savannah's door. She was carrying 2 mugs of coffee and wearing the expression of a woman who had witnessed something she was not going to let pass without comment. Darlene was 62 years old, had lived in the building for 19 years, had buried a husband and raised a daughter, and seen enough of Savannah to feel that she had earned the right to a certain frankness. She was small and solid, with silver-streaked hair and reading glasses perpetually pushed up onto her forehead. "I'm going to need," she said, handing Savannah a mug, "a full explanation." Savannah told her. She told her about the diner, the dead phone, the missed bus, and the 3 men who'd followed her from Broughton Street. She told her about Harris Street and the bar, and the moment she'd made the decision that had seemed insane even as she was making it. She told her about Reed Calloway's face and the word Troy, and the door opening and all those men stepping out into the October night. Darlene listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. When Savannah finished, she sat with her coffee for a moment in silence. "How many of them were there?" she asked. "More than 50. Darlene shook her head slowly. Not with disbelief. Savannah had the impression she believed every word, but with the particular expression of someone reorganizing a piece of their understanding of the world. And none of them said anything. None of them acted like— "No," Savannah said quietly. "None of them." Darlene was quiet again. Outside, the morning traffic was beginning on Drayton Street, and somewhere down the block, a dog was barking at something it would never catch. "I've lived in this city 62 years, Darlene said finally. "I have had people I thought I knew everything about surprise me, but I don't think I've ever been surprised quite like that." Savannah nodded. She'd been awake since 5, sitting on the edge of her bed, and surprise was not quite the word she was using for what she felt. It was more like the vertiginous sensation of a fixed thing in the world, turning out to be different than you'd believed it was. Not better, not worse, just different. And the difference landing in you like a stone in water, sending rings outward into everything. What she hadn't told Darlene, what she barely admitted to herself, was that the story had spread before the morning came. She had a co-worker named Gina, who had a brother who drank at a bar 3 streets from the iron rail, and by midnight Gina's brother had heard enough of an account from someone who'd been walking their dog that he'd texted Gina, and Gina had texted Savannah, and Savannah's phone, charged now, found at the bottom of her tote bag with 8% battery remaining, had woken her at midnight with a message that said, "Is this you? People are talking about this." By morning, it wasn't just Gina's brother. It was a post on a local community board, then a thread on a neighborhood forum, then, because Savannah City had a particular ecosystem of local social media that fed on exactly this kind of story. Something that was beginning to look with growing and alarming momentum like it was going to become something much larger than a walk home. She showed Darlene her phone. Darlene read the thread. Her eyebrows rose steadily as she scrolled. "Child," she said, handing the phone back, "you are about to become news." What neither of them knew yet was that Reed Calloway had been told the same thing. Troy Haynes had shown him his own phone at 8 that morning over eggs at a diner 3 blocks from the iron rail, and Reed had looked at the screen and then set it down on the table between his coffee and his eggs and said, "Huh. It's got 4,000 shares already," Troy said. "I can see that. People are going to want to talk to you." Reed cut into his eggs. "People always want to talk to somebody." "This is different." Reed looked at him. Troy was not a man who used the word different lightly. He'd been riding with Reed for 16 years, had seen him navigate situations that most people would have crossed the street to avoid, and had never once in those 16 years suggested that anything was different enough to warrant particular attention. "Different how?" Reed asked. Troy turned the phone back toward him. The thread had comments now, hundreds of them, and growing. Reed read a few. Then he put the phone down again. "She didn't have anyone to call," he said after a moment. No, Troy agreed. And those guys following her, Reed paused. She wasn't making that up. Obviously not. Reed drank his coffee. Outside the diner's window, Savannah, Georgia was going about its morning. The tourists with their walking maps, the locals with their commuter faces, the live oaks spreading their arms over the squares with the same equanimity they'd maintained for 100 years. It wasn't a big thing, Reed said. We just walked her home. I know, Troy said. That's kind of why it's a big thing. That afternoon, Sheriff Boyd Stanton appeared at the iron rail. He was a tall man, methodical in his movements, with the patient manner of someone who had learned long ago that most situations were better served by listening than by talking. He'd been sheriff of Chatham County for 11 years and had, in that time, developed a working relationship with Reed Calloway that was built on the kind of mutual respect that neither of them would have described as friendship, but that functioned, in practical terms, very similarly. He sat across from Reed at a corner table with a glass of water he hadn't asked for and said, "I'm going to need you to understand the situation you're in." "I'm in a situation?" Reed said. "There are reporters making calls. The story's been picked up by 2 Atlanta stations. That community board post has been shared 40,000 times as of an hour ago." Boyd paused. "And those 3 men who were following her, 2 of them have priors. One of them has a pending assault case." Reed said nothing. "If she'd been followed another 2 blocks," Boyd said quietly, "this would be a different conversation." "Then it's a good thing she wasn't," Reed said. Boyd looked at him for a moment. "She doesn't know how close it was, does she?" It wasn't a question. Reed didn't answer it. "I'm not here to make your life complicated," Boyd said. "I'm here because I think you should know what's coming. And I think she should know too." Reed looked out the window at the street. "She doesn't need to know the details. It'll just scare her." "She's already scared," Boyd said. "She was scared enough to ask a stranger to walk her home." Reed was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "She was." By the following morning, it was everywhere, not just in Savannah, not just in Georgia. The story had been picked up overnight by a wire service whose algorithm had decided, with its characteristic indifference to anything except the mathematics of engagement, that this was the kind of story that travels. By 6 a.m., it was on the feeds of people in Seattle and Baltimore and Minneapolis who would never set foot in Savannah and had no particular stake in its gas lamps or its cobblestones or its complicated history. By 8 a.m., the community board thread had 200,000 shares. By noon, the number had doubled. Savannah Cross sat in her studio apartment and did not know what to do with any of it. Her phone, the same device that had been dead and useless when she'd needed it most, was now so full of notifications she'd turned it face down on the kitchen counter and left it there, unable to deal with the cascade of messages from people she hadn't spoken to in years. Journalists she'd never heard of, and strangers whose investment in her story she couldn't entirely understand. A reporter from an Atlanta TV station had been buzzing her building's intercom since 9. Darlene had intercepted the reporter at the front door with the particular authority of a woman who had been managing other people's problems for 62 years, told him that Ms. Cross was unavailable, and returned upstairs with the expression of someone who has done something satisfying. "You can't stay in here forever," Darlene said. "I'm aware," Savannah said. She was at the kitchen table with her second coffee and the hollow-eyed look of someone who had slept 3 hours. "The question isn't whether this is happening. The question is what you want to do about it." Savannah looked at her. "What are my options?" "You can say nothing. Let it run its course. The Internet's attention span is 72 hours on a good day. Or you can say something on your own terms." Savannah wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. Outside, the morning was grey and soft, the live oaks moving slightly in a wind off the river. "I never wanted to be a story," she said. "I know. I just wanted to get home. I know that too." Darlene paused. "But you're a story now, whether you want to be or not. The only thing you can choose is what the story says." 2 miles away, on a different street, Reed Calloway was having a version of the same conversation with Troy Haynes in the parking lot behind the iron rail. Reed had been approached by 4 journalists since morning. He'd spoken to none of them. He had also, and this he hadn't mentioned to Troy, received a phone call from a man named Kevin Murch. Kevin Murch was 33 years old, and he was one of the 3 men who had followed Savannah home from Broughton Street 2 nights ago. He was the one with the pending assault case that Sheriff Boyd Stanton had alluded to without naming. He had called Reed's personal number. How he'd gotten it was a question Reed had filed away to deal with separately, and said, "I don't know who you think you are, getting involved in things that aren't your business." Reed had listened to the whole statement without interrupting. Then he'd said, "Are you done?" There had been a pause. "You don't know who you're dealing with," Murch said. "Son," Reed said, "I have been doing this since before you were in high school. You have no idea what you're wading into. Go home." He'd ended the call and told Troy about it. Troy's response had been to stand very still for a moment and then say, "I'll make some calls." "You don't need to do that." "I know I don't need to," Troy said. "I'm going to anyway." Reed didn't argue. He'd learned over 16 years that some things were easier to not argue about. The call from Kevin Murch was not what had been sitting in Reed's chest since the previous night, though. What had been sitting there was smaller and less dramatic, and because of that, harder to name. He'd been in this life for 22 years. He'd started riding because it was the one thing, at 22, that had felt like freedom in a life that hadn't offered much of it. He'd become a chapter leader because the men around him had decided he was worth following, a fact he'd never entirely stopped being surprised by. He'd accumulated a reputation that was not entirely unearned and not entirely deserved, and that sat on him the way most reputations sit on people who've had them long enough, like a coat that no longer fits right, but that you'd forgotten how to take off. People were afraid of him. He'd known this for a long time. Most people who saw him coming, in his vest, with his ink and his grey beard and his history, moved to the other side of the street, which was fine. He'd stopped caring about that about 15 years ago, but Savannah Cross had not moved to the other side of the street. She had walked toward him, shaking and determined, and asked him to walk her home. Not because she trusted him, he understood, but because she was out of options and had decided to bet her safety on the human inside the reputation. She had looked at the thing the world had made of him and decided it was worth the risk. He was still thinking about that. He was thinking about it when Sheriff Boyd Stanton called and said, in the careful tone of a man delivering information he would rather not have to deliver, "We picked up Kevin Murch an hour ago. Turns out the assault case caught up with him faster than expected. He's going to be tied up for a while." "Good," Reed said. "There's something else," Boyd said. "The woman, Ms. Cross. She called us this morning. She gave a statement. She was very specific, very clear. She knew the street, the time, what was said." A pause. "She's been dealing with that kind of thing for a while, Reed. That wasn't the first time." Reed said nothing. "She did the right thing, asking for help," Boyd said. "And whoever she asked it from, they did the right thing too." After he hung up, Reed stood in the October light behind the iron rail for a long time without moving. Then he went inside and told Troy that he thought they ought to go find Savannah Cross and have a conversation that wasn't happening in the middle of the street. Troy looked at him for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "Probably." What happened when Reed Calloway knocked on the door of the apartment building on Drayton Street was not dramatic, because Reed was not a dramatic man, and Savannah, having thought about Darlene's words all morning, had decided that her only tool in this situation was straightforwardness. She buzzed him in. They sat in her kitchen, Reed and Troy and Savannah, and inevitably Darlene, who had appeared at the sound of the door with her reading glasses on her forehead and the expression of someone who had decided she was part of this. And they talked for an hour, not about the story, not about the cameras, not about Kevin Murch or the pending charges or the 40 million impressions on the community board thread. They talked about Savannah, where she was from, what had brought her to Georgia, what she'd built here. They talked about the diner and the spider plant and the regular customers who knew her name. They talked about Darlene's African violets and the leaking faucet and the Friday phone calls with Dana in Atlanta. And Reed Calloway, who had not asked a personal question of anyone in as long as he could remember, looked at this woman across a kitchen table and asked, "You doing okay?" She looked at him. "I'm getting there," she said. 3 weeks later, Savannah Cross stood in front of a camera for the first time. She had chosen the journalist carefully, a woman from Savannah's local paper, not the television stations with their live trucks and their light rigs, but a print reporter named Addie Norwood, who had left 3 voicemails over 4 days with the patient manner of someone who understood that the story would wait for the person who had lived it. Savannah had listened to all 3 messages twice before calling back. She had decided, finally, that Darlene was right. The story was going to exist with or without her. The question was what it said. She did the interview in the diner where she worked, on a Tuesday morning before the breakfast rush, with the October light coming through the windows at a low angle and the smell of coffee and pancake batter in the air. She told the story simply. She told it the way it had happened. The dead phone, the missed bus, the 3 men, the fear, the decision that had seemed insane, and what came after. She didn't dramatize it. She didn't reach for significance. She said, when the reporter asked why she thought it had resonated with so many people, "I think because it doesn't fit the story people have already decided is true." "Which story?" the reporter asked. "Both of them," Savannah said. "The one about me and the one about them." The article ran on a Saturday. It was, by the standards of local journalism, very widely read. It was shared by people who disagreed about almost everything else, which suggested, to Savannah at least, that something in it had landed somewhere beneath the layers of opinion and allegiance, where people are still, most of them, fundamentally the same. Reed Calloway read it on his phone at the iron rail. He didn't share it, because he didn't share things on the internet. But he read it twice, which was 2 more times than he read most things. The line he kept coming back to was this: she had looked at the thing the world had made of him, and decided it was worth the risk. She hadn't said that exactly. Addie Norwood had written it. But when Savannah read it, she thought, that's right. That was the thing she hadn't been able to name until she saw it in someone else's words. She had been walking toward danger and had chosen the danger she could look in the eye. She had made herself vulnerable to the thing she feared most, and it had turned out to be something else entirely. The weeks that followed were not transformative in the dramatic sense. Savannah's life did not change in the ways that stories about lives sometimes change them in the telling. She still worked at the diner. She still lived in the apartment with the leaking faucet. She still talked to Dana on Friday nights, and still forgot occasionally to water the spider plant. What changed was subtler. The 3 men who had followed her that October night were dealt with by the legal system. Kevin Murch's assault case moved forward, and the other 2 were interviewed by Sheriff Stanton's office. None of that made the national news, because it was the unglamorous machinery of consequence rather than the clean arc of justice that stories prefer. But Savannah followed it and was grateful for it and understood that it mattered. What also changed was that she was no longer entirely alone in the city in the way she'd been. Darlene had always been there, but now Darlene was there in a different way, the way of someone who has been a witness and become, because of it, something more than a neighbor. They had coffee most mornings. Darlene was teaching Savannah to care for African violets, which it turned out required a great deal of patience and indirect light, and the willingness to forgive yourself when you got it wrong. And then there was Reed Calloway. They were not friends exactly, in the conventional sense of the word. They were people who had met in an unusual way and had found, in the aftermath of it, that they had more in common than the world would have predicted. They talked occasionally, at the diner once, where Reed appeared on a Tuesday morning for coffee, and Savannah's shift happened to overlap. At the counter outside the iron rail another time, where Savannah had walked past on purpose and then been embarrassed by the purposefulness of it. They talked about Savannah, the city, not the woman, about what it meant to live somewhere that was beautiful and complicated and full of history that hadn't finished being reckoned with. About what it meant to be someone who didn't fit the shape of the place and lived there anyway, because living required picking a place, and this place had gotten under their skin. One afternoon, walking along the waterfront after the tourist traffic had thinned, Reed said, "You know what people got wrong about that night?" "What?" Savannah said. "They kept saying you were brave for asking." He paused. "But you weren't brave because you weren't afraid. You were brave because you were scared as hell and you did it anyway." She looked at him. "There's a difference," he said. "Yeah," she said, "there is." She thought about that for a long time after. She thought about the way the world builds its categories. The people who are supposed to be dangerous, the people who are supposed to be protected, the people who are supposed to matter, and the people who are supposed to wait outside that consideration in the cold. She thought about how long she'd spent navigating a life built on those categories, adjusting her route and her hours and her phone charge and her expectations to accommodate a world that had already decided what she was. She thought about 50-some men stepping out of a bar on a Thursday night because someone had asked for help, and not one of them making it complicated. She thought about what it meant that the most dangerous-looking people in that street had been the ones who treated her with the most ordinary decency. She thought about all the assumptions that had shattered, hers, theirs, everyone who was watching. And what was left when the assumptions were gone? What was left, she thought, was just people. Complicated, contradictory, occasionally surprising people doing what people could do when they decided to. The Spanish moss moved in the October wind over the river. The gas lamps came on along the walk, one after another, as the afternoon light faded. Somewhere across the water, a boat was coming in with the tide. Savannah Cross walked home in the early dark, and she was not afraid.